Welcome to the Living Medicine podcast, where we talk about ethical medical use of psychedelic psychotherapy, teaching skills, examining the issues, and interviewing interesting people. Now let's start today's show.
Hi, it's Dr. Sandy Newis and Dr. Signi Goldman, your host for Living Medicine, where I interview licensed clinical and medical professionals who really break down the evolving ketamine and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy overall space. Recent interviews that we've done with Dr. Ron Siegel, Dr. Dick Schwartz, and Dr. Michael and Annie Mithofer, we encourage you to check those out. Those are available through our podcast and on our YouTube channel. This message is brought to you by the Living Medicine Institute, a growing professional network with content and resources for the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy community. And I have Chad here from Rise 25. And Chad has done thousands of interviews with successful entrepreneurs and CEOs. And we're actually flipping the script. So he's going to be interviewing us. So Chad, welcome to the show. And thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking with both of you today. Why don't we get started just to learn a little bit more about you? You're both psychedelic-assisted psychotherapists. What inspired each of you to kind of go down that road? Why don't you start out, Dr. Signi?
Gosh, it's a bit of a long story, but I think one way of kind of putting it in a nutshell is that my life accidentally fell into this unexpected pathway where I almost had two lives. I had this professional life where I went to medical school, became a mainstream psychiatrist, and had a mental health practice. And then I've always had this other life, which for a long time was just more in my personal life than my professional, which is involved in working with altered states and shamanic and indigenous forms of healing, sort of ceremonial forms of healing. So it was always an interest of mine. When psychedelic and altered state therapies became more emergent in mental health and it became apparent that they had healing properties, it became sort of an obvious bridge for me to meld the two. So I was one of the early adopters of bringing in the legal psychedelic at the time, which was ketamine, into my clinical practice in the States, and using what I knew from those traditions and those teaching traditions to kind of meld that with the science-based, literature that was coming out showing that psychedelics were actually really helpful for depression and anxiety. So I started pulling that into my clinical practice, about 8 years ago. And because following that, there became like a upsurge in interest in that from other professionals for the same reasons. And because I had already started doing that, I started being approached by people that wanted more training or information. And it led to the eventual development of a training program in a collaboration with Sandy. So
great. What about you? What about you, Dr. Sandy?
Well, I have been sort of following and tracking and involved in psychedelic culture and the development of the field really for my entire adult life. I have been studying psychology and psychotherapy, really feels like forever, since high school. And really, when I look at the things that have influenced my life the most outside of my important relationships are really non-ordinary states of consciousness. So finding that through nature and the outside world, through finding that through dance, meditation, mindfulness practice, and ultimately psychedelic states. So I've been excitedly following the research and kind of exploring all the different applications of that really throughout my entire life. So it's woven into who I am in the world as well as who I am as a professional. And when Signi and I met around 2017, 2018, and began having conversations about the clinic that she and her husband, Dr. Maydog Goldman, founded. And so I was really excited to kind of merge into that and to finally find a way to really bring all of those pieces together.
Dr. Signi, you mentioned ketamine when you were talking a little bit earlier. How does ketamine-assisted psychotherapy differ from traditional psychotherapy? I mean, some of it's kind of obvious, but give me a little bit more of a breakdown in terms of the difference.
No, it's a great question. I think it's the one that a lot of people have, and is, the understanding of that is evolving even as we speak in the field. Ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is technically a subset of what we call psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So even though ketamine itself is a substance with multiple uses in medicine, it does have the ability to induce a psychedelic altered state And ketamine, as opposed to some of the more traditional psychedelics people think of, like LSD, for example, is legal. And so if you want to induce a therapeutic psychedelic state for someone in a clinic, and if you have the skill set to do that and the training and then ketamine is the one that you can legally use. And so it's been this sort of early adopter psychedelic for most of the people in this space right now, my clinic included. And so it is a form of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy using ketamine. And the term psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy really means what it sounds like, which is you're doing psychotherapy with someone. So this does involve being a skilled psychotherapist, but you're using the psychedelic altered state to kind of enhance the therapy process in a clinic.
Dr. Sandy, how does a psychedelic altered state enhance the therapy process?
Ooh, well, that's a big question. So what we do is we, embed it within a therapeutic process that has preparation and integration on either side. And then the medicine session is a part of that. So psychedelic assisted psychotherapy using ketamine in particular, speaking of that, you can't really separate out that from the preparation and the integration piece. So people often think it's just the medicine, but it's really not. So, the preparation parts are about getting to know the client, doing an extensive developmental history, setting and establishing treatment goals, really building that relationship. And the integration is applying what happens in the session within the context of that which you know in advance. So the medicine session itself helps somebody remove the defensive holds that they're holding on their content. It helps them soften their nervous system. It helps them experience the relationship with me and with themselves differently. And then because of that sort of like loosening of that tightening, loosening of that tightening, but because of that loosening, it allows things to emerge into their consciousness that might otherwise not. And then we partner with the client really to co-create meaning around that comes up in integration.
I see that makes sense. So, can you explain the concept of a trauma-informed approach that you take in your work?
Sure. For me, everything that I do is really trauma informed. So I specialize in trauma throughout my work. And by trauma, I really have a broad definition of that. It isn't processing the trauma. It's a trauma informed approach really is about how that influences how difficult, overwhelming, traumatic circumstances in life overwhelm our sense of safety and security in the world. So really a trauma informed approach is about building that need. So about helping them develop at the very basic level a sense of safety and security with us, with me, with the clinic, with everything that they come in, and building that platform that allows them to safely go into the traumatic material or the things that have influenced them. And then ultimately, it's about kind of shifting somebody's hypervigilance and their constant scanning the world for perceived threat, because trauma ultimately is about them putting that state onto the world and operating from there. So trauma informed care is safety at the most basic level, and then really exploring the way the experiences that somebody's had in their life have led to the way in which they are currently in the world.
Dr. Signi, what role does nature connection play in your therapeutic approach?
Well, it's a big part of our ethos because, on one hand, we're medical professionals and we operate in licensed capacities in mental health clinics. So, this is very much a part of mental health treatment in a real sense. But also, whenever you're altering someone's state of consciousness, by definition, you're touching them into a landscape inside of themselves that is sort of akin to dreaming, right? So, it's touching base with the unconscious. And a lot of the powerful metaphors are nature based and have to do with a sort of more indigenous way of living that we all evolved from. And so when you're working with people in altered states, it's really important to have some background and training in what we call transpersonal realities, which means some people would use the word spiritual experiences for that, but a sort of broader connectedness or something transpersonal that's bigger than oneself. And a lot of time that comes in through a sense of connection with the natural world or the greater creation, or, a sort of finding a home or feeling like you're a sense of a part of that. And so to work with that in a skilled way, as therapists, you need to be able to um, know what to do when that sort of content comes up for someone in a psychedelic session, and have a common language for that, and actually have interventions that help them work with that in a way that's meaningful for them and creates healing or growth. And in a training capacity, when Sandy and I are training therapists in our training program, we intentionally work in overt nature connection activities and training into that, because what happens is anyone who works a lot with psychedelic altered states can tell you that a sort of common language for feeling in community with the natural world is going to naturally come up when you're working with altered states. You know, whether you experience that as spiritual or as like just nature connection or grounding into like the created world. And so if you don't have any, language or skills for working with that, then you're not going to know what to do when clients find this as a really meaningful part of their healing journey.
And could I add something to that too? Just the piece about nature as resource. So, we live in the natural world and we are surrounded by that. And so a lot of, the very tangible pieces of that are building in, connection to the natural world as a resource, because we can all, and resource means kind of connecting into something that can help you find a sense of well-being or at least neutrality. So building that in as a really intentional piece is also a big part of trauma-informed care in the way that we work.
Interesting. Have you found that there are misconceptions about psychedelic assisted therapy? And if so, what are some of the most common ones, Dr. Sandy?
I mean, the most common one is that it's all about the medicine, right? And then, that it's all about the medicine session, and that the preparation and integration we do is all about getting to the medicine, like as if that's the end all be all. And that's just not the case. Like, there are psychedelic sessions that don't happen as part of a therapeutic process, where you might have a therapeutic experience, but that's not therapy. That's not psychotherapy. So it's different. And the other one really is that, well, there's a couple. The other one is that, as if it's like we're on the perfect quest for which medicine to use. And I think as we get deeper and deeper into this, that while ketamine has its properties, in some ways it's really more alike other psychedelics than not. And so we get outcomes and experiences that mirror other types of medicines too. And then the third is that, and this is really kind of more specific to the way that I work. I'm not sure that everybody would agree with this, but that it's not all about getting to the content. So the content meaning like the experience or the bad thing or the hard thing, that really there's kind of an emerging hypothesis for me that we might more and more actually be enhancing people's capacity to experience well-being, and just kind of moving into those directions.
Yeah,
Dr. Signi, yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, I would add one more that we as a whole, as a field, run up against, which is this, what I could call the one and done myth. Just you read this a lot in the media. The idea that like if you do a psychedelic, all your problems will be over, and it's going to just heal you in one fell swoop. And one of the things that Sandy and I do a lot of education around is that it's actually a process. It's a therapy process, and the psychedelic experience is a critical piece of that and can be really change-inducing piece. But yeah, that's a myth we run up against quite a bit.
So how do you address maybe safety concerns in psychedelic assisted therapy?
Well, we practice this in a medical setting. So for us, this is a clinical intervention, like full psychiatric evaluation and a full medical evaluation are part of the vetting process to figure out someone's appropriateness for this kind of treatment. And anything involving taking a substance is medically monitored. So it's physician monitored, and they're tracking your vital signs, and they know your medical history. So there's a medical piece that's really important, and that's part of our model. And then there are psychological safety pieces that are built into the way we work and also the way we train other therapists that have to do with psychological safety in the relationship with the therapist when you're essentially tripping in an altered state, right? It's a very vulnerable state.
Mm-hmm.
So there's important pieces around how the therapist conducts themselves and the contracts and the agreements they make with the client to make sure that it's very collaborative and co-created and very consent-based. And those are built into our training program, and that was really critical pieces, because those are the places where this kind of therapy can go badly, or potentially do harm with therapists that are undereducated on that part.
So it sounds like set and setting is very important in this kind of therapy, Dr. Sandy.
I mean, set and setting in a way you could almost say is everything,
Mm.
because it really is, set is the mindset that the client comes in with. So they need to feel safe. They need to feel like they have a clear understanding of what the process. They need to feel connected to me. They need to feel connected to the team. It's very like, for example, it's very jarring for a client when somebody comes into the room that they don't know. Like, even if they've got an eye shade on, they can feel it. They actually feel kind of the felt sense of the person, and the energetic vibe of the team themselves. So that all of that influences how they go into it. And so they need to feel, they might have trepidation and they might not have nervousness, especially their first time. Like, what is this? What's going to happen? But that's separate from feeling safe and held. And so then that's that setting too, that, they need to feel from minute one at every interface with the clinic that they are cared for, that they are seen as an individual, that their approach is going to be individualized to their needs. And also that we got this, that they feel like we know what we're doing. Like in our training program, we teach step into a soft authority, like, step into holding that container. That container is everything. And soft authority means, with kindness and softness and connection to the client. Because when you're in that non-ordinary state, when you're with the medicine, they've got eye shades on, they're sitting there with a blanket, like, but yet you feel it. I mean, you're feeling into the space. And so all of those different things really influence a client's ability to fully drop into the experience and maximize the therapeutic benefit.
So set and setting are crucial. What role does maybe ceremony and ritual play in your therapeutic approach, Dr. Signi?
Wow, that's actually quite a big topic. And so
Mm.
we have a lot of teaching content around this because that means different things to different people. Certainly, if you come from an indigenous or indigenous inspired lineage, or you work in that way, you're going to understand ceremony a certain way. In what we call the quote underground. So this would be providers that have been doing this in a not legal context for decades, right? Ceremony may be understood in a very different way. And then there's using it in a clinic, in a mental health clinic, with people who are coming in under sort of mental health treatment. And what does ceremony mean in that context? And in that context, we're often talking about neuroscience for, we know that actually certain aspects of ceremony shift someone's state of anticipation or their state of awareness or state of consciousness in some measurable ways. And why we may not think of it as ceremony, right? Because it may be something just that the sort of gestures or routines or actions that you and the client develop together to basically say that we're moving out of sort of everyday life into this dream-like territory. And it's not just something we snap our fingers and pivot. We sort of transition in, we settle in. It's like creating a landing pad for someone to go into an altered state. And that can be very personal to the person. So often in a clinic, people will bring in photographs or objects that are meaningful to them. Sometimes candles or scents. There's things that you can use, and it really needs to be individualized to your client and co-created with them. But there's ways that in clinic you use what you could say the word ceremony, right? This is clinic-based ceremony. It is important because it creates that shift, because most doctors and therapists are not trained to bridge someone from ordinary chit-chat consciousness into what is really like a dream-like dialogue with your own unconscious. You could think of
Mm.
it like metaphorically as akin to a hypnotic state, for example. And so there's things you do to bridge into that shift. And I would say those are clinical versions of ceremony. And the way that we do that, and Sandy and I do it, and the way we train therapists do it, is informed by the use of ceremony in these more these indigenous or nature-based lineage communities, because there's a long, long, long amount of knowledge there about the use of ceremony to shift someone's consciousness. So it is a big topic, but I would say that's an overview of the kinds of things that we teach about.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we can dive into that. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think people also get a little bit nervous about that. I know I have at times in my career, like, oh, the ceremony or this ceremony or that ceremony. Am I doing it right? Do I have the right elements? When really it can be as simple as beginning a session the same way every single time. And helping somebody drop in, and so that they're cued through the rituals in which you start, and that you kind of come out in a similar way. So it doesn't have to be really complex, and it can be individually created with the client as well. It could be as simple as a sacred object, or perhaps lighting a candle, or something that has meaning to them, or even to you as the provider, to help you drop in, because you're also in your own non-ordinary state while you're doing it.
And it is important to differentiate this also from the way that the popular culture often uses the word ceremony, which implies maybe ceremonies that come from specific traditions, like spiritual, religious,
Yeah.
or tribal traditions. We are not doing that, right? And that's also a very big topic. But so when we say ceremony, we're talking about what Sandy just described, like using certain routine rituals to induce and encourage someone into the altered state in a way that's more comfortable.
So once a psychedelic assisted therapy session is over, how do you kind of approach integration, Dr. Sandy?
So integration begins as they're ending, as they're coming out of the medicine. We take notes throughout. So I write down not everything that they say, but most of what they say, and often kind of word for word. That gives them the ability to just like not have to track it. And so at the end of a session for me, I might kind of go through some of the points that I think were the most relevant for them. Just say, I want to just kind of review some of this. These are some things that came up for you. Just want to invite you to kind of notice what comes up for you as I say them. So I'm already cueing them with memory. And then I say, is there anything else that you want to add? Doesn't need to make a ton of sense, but that you want us to track for integration. So I start that at the end of the medicine session. And then we go back through kind of those notes during integration. So for some clients, I'm literally going like play by play. For others, we're just visiting it thematically. Um, and then my job is also to kind of help them and cue them to weave in developmental history as well as what it is that they're there for. One of the things that Signi says in our video training series is, I don't know if you say it exactly like this, Signi, but basically where the rubber meets the road is that this has relevance and meaning for the client's life, because otherwise, like, they're just tripping out and having an interesting experience. So we're really looking for the now what ultimately. Like, how does this help them shift their behavior? How does this help them shift their sense of self? How does this help them shift their felt sense of being in the world? Or what kind of shifts in their felt sense have they had? And how can I help them become aware of that somatically, or in their emotional state, or their cognitive state, or their attentional state, or the way in which they do relationships? So I'm also tracking what I'm noticing and the shifts I'm noticing about how they're engaging with me as well as the way they're describing their experiences.
This has been a very interesting episode. As we kind of wrap it up, Dr. Signi, what advice would you give to someone considering psychedelic assisted therapy?
Well, that's a great ending question because there's so much interest out there and also so much confusion and lack of information. And that's a lot of the reason that we're starting this podcast, because we do speak from experience and authority and an understanding of how to do it safely. So first is make sure that you are someone who's positioned to do this safely if you want to get into this profession. And that starts with making sure that you really have solid clinical skills and you are a good therapist. You know how to do good therapy. Because like Sandy referenced, integration, preparation and integration are huge parts of this work. And you have to do good psychotherapy to help someone land well and really heal from a psychedelic experience if they're, and target the symptoms they're struggling with, for example. And you have to be really trained how to be safe around that. So you need to be an experienced therapist that understands relational dynamics and ethics around touch and patient-client interactions. So be an experienced therapist is one. And then the second is make sure that you get a training program that allows you to experience the altered state yourself. If you are a therapist that wants to go into this field or a professional, you need to really have spent a significant amount of time in an altered state, a psychedelic state, so you understand what your client is experiencing and you know how to help them navigate that. So those would be kind of the first two big pieces of advice. And then there's other, things in there that we could definitely talk about. But I would start there if people are out there that are interested in building this into their career.
Okay,
Mhm.
sounds good. Sandy, anything you'd like to add to that quickly?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to the medical professional piece.
Mhm.
So our training program is for clinicians, therapists, and also medical professionals. And, they may not be well trained psychotherapists, but if they want to work collaboratively as a team with the therapist, then it is important for them to understand the therapeutic process so that it's not just all about safety and medical. It's about building that relationship from minute one. It's about, really partnering with the client and trying to help them understand their process and then they too understanding. I also believe that medical professionals should have their experience with the medicine so that
Mhm.
they can kind of better know how to work with those set and settings so that it's not just all about like monitoring vitals. It's about the way in which they enter the space, the way they come in and out of the room, the way that they say hello and goodbye to the client, all of which seem like very small things, but having that level of awareness and an understanding of not only how the medicine works and the physiological aspects, but the therapeutic process and then the process of being in the state with the medicine itself, I think is really important for medical professionals as well.
I think
Okay.
a great summary statement for this for us, and part of why we want to do this podcast is we want more people to get into this field. There's a huge need and a demand. We want more people to be able to do this well. And we are wary of people jumping in too quickly before it's safe. So we want to welcome more people to learn more about this and to make sure they learn about it safely so that they can do it safely. And I think that that's a good summary of our mission.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Great advice. Hey, I really appreciate both of you having me as part of this podcast today. I'll look forward to hearing future episodes and being a part of future episodes. But I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Chad.
you, Chad. This was really great. We really appreciate it.
So long, everybody.
Thanks for listening to Living Medicine. We'll see you again next time. Be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.